it used to come when I would present at conferences where I would say, this is what we're finding, or this is what I think, or blah, blah, blah. Certain people in the audience or afterwards would be rather negative. I'd be called a Nazi or a hater or whatever.
Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. My guest today is Dr. David Geary. Dr. Geary is a cognitive, developmental, and evolutionary psychologist over at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Dr. Geary had written a blog series called Male Female, where the basis of the blog series is the evolutionary basis for some of the differences between men and women, male and female in general. And for me, it's an interesting topic in general, where I'm intrigued in the science and the data behind things. And this topic's a little sensitive, right? There are many out there that would say there is no difference between men and women, or between boys and girls, or between male and females. And I know it's sensitive. I know it's a sensitive issue. There's a lot of sensitivities around those general concepts. We get to the transgender thing, whether you touch on, women or men not being equally represented in the workforce in some way. There's a lot of landmines you can step in just having this conversation. I don't think that should be a reason for us not to have the conversation, though, especially when the goal is to just understand better and to look at the science, look at the data, and actually try to understand each other better, whether it's to better relationships, whether it's to bring children up better, whatever it might be. If the goal is compassion and just search for truth and search for data, I think it's silly to try to avoid these topics. I don't think this got all too controversial, but we circled around some topics that I know are a little bit volatile. So, but anyway, I think we kept it. I think we kept it relatively in the safe zone, but I don't think we shied away from anything. So, all right, and with that, I give you Dr. David Geary. All right, well, David, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So, I guess before we jump in, could you kind of give a little bio on yourself and what you got going on, who you are?
Yeah, sure. So the male-female theme actually is the title of one of my books. I've done two editions on male-female, the evolution of human sex differences, and the third edition will be out this summer. And the Psychology Today blog is based basically on different chapters in the book.
Oh, okay.
So writing about that, I study sex differences. I'm interested in sex differences in vulnerability to stressors. So how the males and females differ and how they respond to toxin exposures, for example. And in my other life, I study kids' mathematical development. Right now we're studying how they understand different aspects of algebra.
Interesting. I mean, that already we're getting to, heated debate type stuff, right? I mean, you go.
Oh, sure.
I mean, and we'll get. I'll just jump in a little bit to some of where I think this is going to go. But in these studies, is there a pressure? Do you feel a pressure in the community, whether it's colleagues or professionally, or even just social media? Are you stumbling into territory that's you see a flashlight on you a little bit? I mean, because sometimes you dig into some of these, you're asking these scientific questions, and I'll just assume for the sake of argument. Now, I don't know you personally, but I'll assume that you just want to know. You're a scientist. You want to know the answers. You're trying to get at data, and you want to look at statistics. Now, I assume that your colleagues push. Is there some pressure to not find the wrong answer, if you will? You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's actually a lot of pressure not to find the wrong answer or not to uncover the truth. And so I've been doing this work for 25 years or so, and the amount of pressure you get kind of waxes and wanes. It was pretty high in the 90s for a while, and then it calmed down. But then when the Summers incident at Harvard occurred. It kind of peaked back up, and then the last few years, it's been probably the worst it's ever been in my experience.
Really?
But thankfully, thankfully, I'm pretty socially insensitive, and so it's not really. I mean, it has no effect on what I'm going to do.
Right. Yeah, so it's almost depressing, but I guess the rub comes in with a lot of folks where, you know, if you are relying on funding or income, that could, you know, in some way impact your life. You know, you tend to be under, and I'm not saying you personally, but a lot of professionals tend to be in that mindset where they're pressured to, you know, they're caught between a crossroads between earning a living and being a scientist and also putting food on the table. So
Right.
that dichotomy is tough, and it's unfortunate. I was hoping you would say no, I don't see any pressure, and they'd give me some hope. But I was just guessing with the topic you're into that you'd be feeling, you know, that the general theme of PC culture, just kind of trying to slap science around, and I think it's silly. But
yeah. Most of the pressure, well, it used to come when I would present at conferences where I would say, you know, this is what we're finding, or this is what I think, or blah blah blah. And, you know, certain people in the audience or afterwards would be rather negative. You know, I'd be called a Nazi or a hater or whatever.
The good old Nazi word. They could use that. They can pull that in. They could apply that to anything. It's amazing.
That's always a perfect fallback. But, you know, or get nasty emails. So I just don't do public talks on these things anymore. I just do my work. But then, you know, you write an article and you send it, and an editor reads it, and the reviewers read it, and a lot of these things, you know, sometimes you have to submit to 3 or 4 places before an editor will even send it out for comments.
Right.
You know, it's frustrating and delays things, but we still get things done.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, if you just stay true to what you're trying to do, and you're just trying to, you know, find data in the noise, and if that data comes out convenient or inconvenient, that should be inconsequential. But I guess the point is, other people may use that data for their own agenda, but that's not your problem. I mean, at least that's the way I look at it. It's not the scientist's problem. It's really not. So let's jump into your blogs a little bit, and I think it'll be this guise of this political correctness discussion throughout the whole thing. But so you did 3 blogs that I really sent you notes on. I would say they kind of go into they kind of go from least controversial to most controversial, I'd say. But you know, one was on men's parenting. It's evolution and maintenance, which I found super interesting. Just being a dad, right? And I had discussion a lot with friends my age and you know, fellow parents that are kind of seeing the differences between what being a mom is and what being a dad is, and you kind of gave some good, I'd say, scientific insight into what some of those differences are. I guess could you maybe just give an outline of the overall theme of the article, what you're looking to find?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, you know, really the most fascinating thing about it is that we have any male parenting at all in our species. So if we look at mammals generally, you know, maybe 10% so show some amount of male investment, usually protection of offspring often from other males. But the vast majority don't do anything. And if we look at our 2 closest relatives, chimps and bonobos, you know, there's zero male investment. And so, you know, often we'll hear complaints that men aren't doing their fair share, which, you know, okay, you know, I understand the complaint. But on the other hand, you know, the real interesting question is, why are men doing anything at all from this broader perspective?
I'm going to use that one next time my wife lets me know that, you know, accuses me for not doing enough. Well, you could have married a chimpanzee.
Yeah, that's right. Good luck for that. We'll see how that one goes.
Doesn't exactly set the bar. Yeah, right. Well, no, but it is interesting. I mean, that's because that is the first thing you called in the article. That's, you know, and I guess you kind of lead to the answer. There's got to be some evolutionary reason why we're doing it, right?
Right. And so if we look at primates generally, when you see males sticking around for, could be for a few weeks, a few months, or it could be for years, with females and with their offspring, it's usually to protect them because there are, infanticidal and other sorts of risks to them. They're not feeding them or going out and getting them bananas or whatever it is. They're physically to protect them. And that's probably where it started with our ancestors. And the argument I've made, I think I mentioned it in the blog, but I mentioned it elsewhere anyway, that our ancestors were probably more like gorillas than chimpanzees. In gorillas, you see long-term male-female relationships. I mean, it may be with 3 or 4 females, but in any case, it's generally long-term. And their offspring form kind of large family units. And the male is very important for protecting and keeping not only the females, but especially the offspring safe. And I think that's where it all started.
I mean, so it's almost like, and this might be selfish thinking, but is it fair in a human culture? And again, this is not to create excuses or this, because there's plenty of deadbeat dads and moms out there as well, right? So this is not to create excuses, but again, we're trying to understand some of the science, some of the evolution. Is it almost unfair to have the same expectation of a dad's involvement versus a mom if you look at some of this data, or is it, is it more natural for a mom to nurture and bring up their child than a dad? Is that a fair question? And what would you think that answer would be based on just some of the findings and from some of the science behind it?
Well, sure. It's a very fair question. And if we look at mammals generally, the female is the primary caregiver in the vast majority of those species, and that's true in primates as well. And if we look at humans across cultures, the primary caregiver is the mom. And in these traditional cultures, you see a lot of sex segregation. The males are doing their thing. Could be hunting, could be raiding, having herds of cattle or whatever it is they're doing. And the women are doing something else that is often centered around taking care of kids. It's only in a few cultures where you see really heavy male involvement in caregiving, but even there, it's not as much as the women do.
Right, and we've sort of, if you look at our history, just since historical record, even that's been the default of the male role and the female role, and I would argue it was the default because it was just a natural genetic default, and that's what folks, that's what us humans we just defaulted to what we were good at and what we were interested in. Period. To sounds blunt, and now come full circle. It's 2019, and that, just even making that statement is some kind of how it could come across as chauvinistic, right? If just me being a male talking to you, another male, I think that again, I think that's silly. I think just the little we've chatted, so far. I think you to know where I'm coming from. Where hey, I think that's silly. I'm not going to subscribe to that. But now again, 2019, the roles which everything's supposed to be equal, but it doesn't see. It seems to be going in the weird direction where there's a forcing function that's unnatural. I don't know. It doesn't seem natural to be expecting everyone to want to do the same thing, both male and female, as opposed to just celebrating our differences and our interests. Men have different interests than women, and vice versa. You know what I mean?
Well, right, yeah, and you have to remember that many women are just fine with the sexual division of labor. It's just some women don't care for it.
Sure. And some women, some males are amazing stay-at-home dads. I know a few of them, and they're fantastic at it, and they love it. So there's my only point is, if whatever the interest and the intrinsic interest a person has, they should be allowed to explore that without trying to force policy to there's just I don't know. There's an overreach happening, and I think it's this whole PC overcorrection thing. But interesting.
Right. Well, what people lose sight of is that, 100 years ago, there really weren't good, safe alternatives to breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
And women who were able to stay home and breastfeed their kids, take care of their kids directly, rather than having a wet nurse, for example, their kids had much lower mortality rates, oftentimes significantly lower mortality rates. There were advantages to the traditional role. Now, with reduction in infant mortality rates due to, better hygiene, healthcare, vaccines, so forth, formulas,
right.
That's not as critical anymore. But you don't have to go back for many generations where it made a difference.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing. It's technology does change what we can do. Whether or not we should do it's another thing, but it changes what we can do for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, medical science, technology. Yeah. It really challenges our what challenges our I would say our evolution for sure, and I think accelerates so much faster than our bodies or our psyches have changed. We're in this weird quandary where now men can do what women used to do, and vice versa. What do we do? It's interesting.
Right.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's like we're not bound by the genetic disposition of our gender anymore. It's almost like we just have other options. Which again, I think we should focus on the positive aspects of that and not try to just convolute it with forced, this forced. A should be doing exactly what B is doing, and B should be doing exactly what A is doing. You know what I mean? But, interesting. Now, do you see? A question I had for you is generally, in terms of parenting, there's a more of a male role and more of a female role that a child will witness growing up in a traditional home. Just take it, for example, just as a mom and as a dad, a male and a female. Are there traits in both the mom and the dad that I would imagine that some of the traits that a mom would be better at exuding, if you will, to a child, female traits, would be equally as important as the traits of what a male would show. So a child growing up with both female, I guess I'd say emotions or reactions to things, and also equally seeing a dad with his male emotions and male reactions to things. Is that the ideal I would say upbringing for a child? Is that the ideal environment, or does that even get wishy-washy in terms of what a child should be growing up seeing, in terms of their behavior and their adjusting as an adult and things like that?
Yeah, so great question. So mom and dads do have different ways of interacting with kids. Dads are more exciting, or kind of agentic, engaging, and physical activities, rough and tumbles of things, more risk-taking types of activities. And these seem to be important for helping kids learn to kind of manage their arousal and excitement.
Right.
And dads are also better at just kind of disciplining, kind of putting their foot down and kind of putting an end to whatever nonsense the kid is engaged in. That becomes really important in adolescence, when kids start to get a sense of independence from the family, a bit rebellious, and so forth. And so kids who have, adolescent kids, boys and girls who have their dads around and engage with them, are just much less likely to get into trouble, like doing drugs, early sexual activity, dropping out of school, all of those things. Having the dads there seems to contribute to kind of keeping all of that in check and keeping the kid on track.
Right.
Yeah, moms are generally calmer, engage in a lot more of the routine care, the social emotional component of how the kids are doing, dealing with issues with their friends or whatever might be going on with them. Generally, kids do best when they are in, a traditional family, mom and dad. It doesn't mean that mom doesn't work and dad doesn't engage in some of the house care, but a two-parent household where the parents get along pretty well, those kids just statistically do better.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's none of this is to ever say that a lesbian family or a homosexual family or whatever the family dynamic can't raise an absolute perfect child. I always wonder if there's natural tendencies of a quote unquote traditional dad and natural tendencies of a traditional mom that without those two, there'd be something missing in the child's life. Some folk, and I like to believe if there's just absolute love in the household, then it doesn't really matter. But I'm just, I don't know if the science supports that or if it's just too early to tell and all that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting to see because there's a lot more of non-traditional type upbringings that you see. And I'm just wondering what that could do to some of the developmental issues of the kids may see.
Right. Yeah, it may be too early to tell for sure, but on average, there are more kids with issues and who grew up in non-traditional families.
Yeah. I mean, I would venture to say, even non-scientifically, just my gut would be telling me two loving parents, no matter what their, I don't know, whatever their sexual orientation is or whatever, or even one, parent, I would say, that situation must be much, much better than a traditional family where it's so much dysfunction, they're fighting and there's domestic abuse. I mean, that I would imagine that goes without saying, but yeah. Now you had, jumping to a slightly more controversial topic, the blog was called Boys and Girls Culture, Evolutionary Perspective on Friendships. This one for me is interesting just because, growing up, as a boy, I wanted to do boy things. I wanted to ride my bike real fast, jump off my bike with no helmet on, try to defy death every possible way I could. And all my friends, the male friends, the boyfriend, we're all boys and we all did the same thing. The girls were very different, and it was just very different. It's just, they were not taking risks like we were. We were definitely dumber. They seemed to mature quicker. And it all seemed to be what you laid out in your article. And now you come full circle, 2019, and we start hearing that those distinct behavioral differences are because of societal pressure and parental pressure and the subtle cues that society plays in the role of, what the child sees. And I just like to call BS on that, frankly. Wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Yep, I call BS on it as well. It's mostly wrong. Frankly, basically, when people make these arguments, they get the arrows backwards. They think that, so they observe boys engaging in risky behaviors, girls playing with dolls or just chatting with one another, whatever they're doing. So they observe it and they say, okay, well, that's a sex-typed behavior, which they can call a stereotype. And then they argue that, well, this stereotype is causing those differences, when really the differences are coming largely from the cultures and activities that boys and girls are creating for themselves. And these stereotypes are often accurate and simply a description of differences. It's not a causation of those differences.
Right. Those stereotypes, in my opinion, are an observation of what was there already. That's really what it was, right? Yeah, and it's some of the and I think I put a note here too, and I think you may have touched on it as well. I'm sure there are societal cues that are so subtle that maybe because I believe there's exceptions to even everything we're talking about. So I always want to keep that door open, just to be there's exceptions to everything. So perhaps there are some, maybe it's children that are fighting their identity and things like that. And the societal cues might be whether explicit or implicit or subtle, no matter how subtle. There may be some of that, and that would force a boy or a girl to go against their just genetic nature, whatever that may be. because they just feel like society's saying that, or or forcing them down that direction, or parental guidance is showing that kind of those forcing functions. But to normalize that whole thing and say it's all because of just societal pressure and what's on TV and what we've is just kind of silly. I just think it's silly. I really do. And I don't know. Is any of that changing? Do you think? I mean, is again? This must be one. I feel like in your world, is this an extra, I would guess, volatile area to be studying?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just write. I just call them the way I see them, and I don't do media or any of that. So, so I'm not particularly worried about it. Now, there are cultural influences, but they seem to operate mostly by either exaggerating sex differences. So boys engage in rough and tumble play and so forth. And if they live in a culture where there's a lot of male-on-male violence, a lot of raiding between villages or whatever, parents, especially dads, kind of encourage that and even ramp it up, make it more aggressive. Now, in other societies where most men aren't in the military, they're not, engaging in, a lot of physical aggression with one another, such as our society, the tendency tends to be to try to suppress that type of behavior in boys. And I think we see a lot of that in our culture. So it's not creating the differences. In this instance, it's trying to tamp them down.
Right.
So, yeah, you got a bunch of 9-year-old boys, at the mall that start roughhousing and having a lot of fun, hitting each other, jumping on one another, and so forth. Are their moms going to encourage it? No,
right,
I mean,
right.
they're going to and they're going to suppress it and make sure it doesn't happen, and so forth. So they haven't created anything. They're suppressing what boys would prefer to do.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting too. Just being in this, whether reading your blogs, I'm always thinking about these certain things or paying attention to what the next, political correctness type theme is out there. It's looking at my own just personal life where I'll hear something like where my son will pick up a doll and walk around with it or something when he was younger, and the like maybe my dad or I would be thinking, hey, don't you want to play with a truck instead? But in my head, I'm like, well, if he wants to play with the doll, go for it. I don't, but it's not. But you just, I feel like I was cognizant of that because I've had this discussion since my kids were even younger with certain folks, and just observing it and I've had a very keen eye to just the natural default, I would say, that they behavior that they land on. And it's certainly, I would never, I'd say my data sets of two, I have two kids, right? They're 4 and 6. My limited data set would say there's absolutely, there's been no parental or societal impact pushing them to do either. My daughter was playing quote unquote family all morning this morning. And she just loved it. She was, it's so obvious that was her happy place. And there was no influence. In fact, she told me to get out of the room. She didn't want me around. So you know what I mean? So it was just it's silly to take that. And I don't know where others get the opposite perspective where that's caused from something as opposed to coming from within. Kind of crazy.
Yeah, that's just their own personal wishes that how the world would work. The sex differences in early behaviors, preferences, and so forth are very, very large, and they're hard to miss. They're correlated with prenatal and early postnatal exposure to testosterone, for instance. There's no question that these are natural biases that boys and girls are creating for themselves. And there's been studies of parents in Western, wealthy Western countries that show that, for decades and decades, parents have been treating boys and girls pretty similarly. But you still get these differences. There's even been studies of families who have raised their kids in terms of kind of, traditional roles sort of thing, dad works, mom stays home, to more progressive child rearing where, they buy dolls for boys and trucks for girls and say, boys and girls can play with dolls and trucks or whatever. And what those studies show is that boys and girls then have different beliefs about, okay, is it okay for boys to play with dolls? And say, yeah, sure, it's okay. But then when you cut these kids loose and let them play with other kids, there's no difference in their behavior.
Right.
They're raised in kind of gender-neutral environment, but then the boys go and play rough and tumble play or with the trucks, and the girls are attracted to the dolls and playing family and so forth. So the beliefs change a bit, but they're still kids. They behave just like every other kid.
Right. And so in general, I mean, the studies back all this up. This is not just a, nonsense opinion based on it. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, and you cite a few of those studies in that blog. I forget what the, actually there was the next blog. It was Danella and Wisegram had that. That was going the other direction. And then there was Tannenbaum and Leeper, I guess. Now, actually, so that's a little bit jumping ahead, but could you, what was, because that third blog was pretty much related to exactly what we're talking about. Could you summarize that study, that Danella and Wisegram? Am I saying that name right? Wisegram?
Yeah, I think it's close enough.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's this overarching belief, and as we said before, that society and stereotypes and so forth are creating all of these differences. One problem is that the research just didn't, as I stated, research didn't back up the claim that moms and dads were treating boys drastically differently. In fact, they're treating very, very much the same. And so there was, and so that kind of put an end to that argument that it's explicit differential treatment. And so then the argument moved to, well, it's much more subtle sorts of things, advertisements. Kids see on television, advertisements for dolls and it's girls, and advertisements for trucks and it's boys. And boys and girls are picking up on those, on those subtle cues that this is what boys do, this is what girls do, those types of things. And so, except that boys and girls like the same sort of thing, even when they're not exposed much to that type of advertisement. So the argument has gone from, well, explicit, moms and dads are doing this or society is doing this, to very, very subtle sorts of cues. And they keep going to subtle sorts of cues, like, parents are buying kids these types of toys rather than that, because the argument keeps melting away. I mean, the evidence keeps going against their position that society is creating all of these differences, and they get weaker and weaker and harder to see arguments. And it's the whole thing is a house of cards. And again, if we look at parents' attitudes about what boys and girls should do, their stereotypes or whatever, there's a modest relation between what the parents think and what the kids think. But there's a weak or no relation between what the parents think and what the kids actually do when they're left to their own devices.
Right. So was there any, I think that to that Danella and Wisegram study, what did it end up showing? And was it debunked, or is it just kind of?
Now that is the one about the toy play.
Yeah, right.
The toys. Yep. Oh, yeah. Okay, right. Well, so if you put boys and girls in a room with a bunch of toys, boys are going to gravitate to certain types of toys, and girls are going to gravitate to other types of toys. You have two interpretations of that, two basic interpretations. One is that, well, boys like types of toys that involve what I've argued is non-biological motion, kind of things moving in space, like a toy car will roll
across, the floor. Girls like things that they can hold and talk to and cuddle, and they like things that allow them to reenact family dynamics. Mm-hmm. And they're drawn to those. My argument is that boys and girls are going to do this independent of social context and social influences if they're given the opportunity to engage with these types of toys. Now, they may explore the other type, the toys of the other sex a little bit, but they'll lose interest pretty quickly and move on to what they like. Now, the consistent argument is that girls are playing family-related things and boys are playing, rough and tumble and, vehicles and so forth, is because society keeps sending them these messages that this is what they're supposed to do. It's like they're being programmed by television commercials, subtle things their parents say, or the types of toys they get for Christmas or birthdays or whatever. And I think, again, the causal error was backwards. Parents buy boys certain types of toys and girls other types of toys because they figured out that's what they like, right, or that's what the kids have asked for. Mm-hmm. And that's coming from the kid. It's not the parents are causing these differences. But and so all of these arguments are that all of these differences are being caused by social factors. And therefore, if we change society, we no longer allow commercials that only show girls playing with dolls or only show boys playing with, toy trucks. That we change the message that will make boys and girls the same. And it won't.
I don't even know why we would want boys and girls to be the same. I mean, there's plenty. I don't know. It's just it. I wonder, because I'm always an advocate of saying, well, there's a million things my wife is generally, or my daughter is generally better at than myself or my son, and vice versa. So why not just celebrate those strengths and weaknesses, and as opposed to just trying to just jam all that good stuff into my side and jam all my good stuff on her side? Like, it seems very. And I wonder. And again, this is getting a little more political, but what the pressure that you feel or you see, or the agenda that's out there, what is the driving? What is the main? Because I always try to be compassionate. I'm thinking, okay, if someone, this gets into the transgender issue, and if someone has maybe a child that is struggling with their identity, I have two kids, and I haven't had to deal with those complications, so I can't truly understand them. But I imagine if my boy or my girl were showing interest in the opposite. Their interest in the opposite gender interests, that it would get really complicated really quickly for my household and for my my child, and my child's going to be first. So I'm probably going to lash out at society and try to fix it. Now, whether society should respond in kind or we should talk about this at the right level is, I guess, another question. But do you feel like there's some of that out there where some of this is coming from that, which I think is a vast minority, or is there other just agenda-driven, I guess, forces out there, or do you not even know or pay attention to that stuff?
Well, yeah, I think the gender dysphoria and the focus on transgender and all that is fairly recent.
Right.
As social media is and that the press for men and women and boys and girls to be equal in everything has a much longer history. And
True.
I think a lot of it is, I think most people, the vast majority of the population is fine. Girls are going to do what they're going to do, boys are going to do what they're going to do, and so forth. But there are a lot of activists who really want men and women to be equal in all outcomes that are important in society. So, same number of men and women CEOs, but it's okay that there's more men who are homeless.
Right.
So a lot of it is kind of a segment of the population among gender activists that are very competitive with men. and are, I think there's a lot of envy and resentment there, and they want to change it. They want their group, who they I think over-identify with, to be just as successful as men have been culturally, and it hasn't happened. And so there's all this push to change society in a way that they think will make it happen.
Well, you touched on something a second ago, equal outcome, and that's just dangerous, right? I mean, equal opportunity, 100%. We all need to be on board with that, equal opportunity. But when you start forcing or looking at policies to enact quote unquote equal outcome, that just doesn't work, right? So I think it just doesn't work, right? I mean, it's just, again, silly.
It doesn't work, and usually creates more problems than it attempts to solve.
Right. I think the problem is where, and this was a debate, and I don't know, some of the, there's a bunch of those studies that came out there where there's many more men in engineering and there's many more women in nursing, and all these things coming out to try to just force that equal quota on both sides. When I'm a computer engineer by trade. When I graduated engineering school, I think there was 1 or 2 women in the entire class. We just didn't see them. Was that because society made it hard for them to get into it? No, they didn't have interest, and they were much less interested. And the ones that were there, frankly, were awesome. They were brilliant. They were very, very good at it. The few women that were in it, they're probably smarter than half the men that were in the whole program. But they were interested in it. They got in it because they had a tendency towards math and science, and they loved it. To try to like change and give incentives for women to get in something they're not interested, or vice versa. And I know male nurses that are amazing at it, but they're the minority. I don't know. I'm trying to keep an open mind to this whole thing, but it's just the silliness and the ridiculousness is so obvious to me when you strip away all the crap. It's just it's crazy. It's so crazy.
Yeah. So there's a couple of issues there. One is, so if you look at women physicists and compare, their abilities, their math skills, their interests, and so forth, they're very similar to men physicists.
Mm-hmm.
The women have a constellation of abilities and interests that are more different than the average woman than is the case for male physicists. Mm-hmm. So you're right. Those that go into the same field tend to be pretty similar to one another, whether they're men or women. On the other hand, as societies become richer, there's more social safety nets, there's more economic, occupational niches. Sex differences in occupational choices and personality, and a lot of other things actually become larger, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect if society is creating these differences.
Right.
The more women you have in the workforce, the more women you have in politics, the more women in education and so forth, you'd say, well, it's a pretty open, gender equal society. And it's in those societies where you get the big gaps between women in computer science and men in nursing.
Right. Yeah. Now, we also have to, on the flip side, I think we all should call it out when we see that, say a man is trying to get into nursing or a traditional female job. If there's any blocking of that, if there's any de-incentivizing of that, that should be called out immediately. And the same for a woman. If a woman's trying to rise to be a CEO, and we all owe it to ourselves as a society to call out anytime we see that being disincentivized or blocked or made it extra difficult. But I think that's where it should stop, right there, not trying to try to put, you go the extra step, and now we're putting laws and policies in place where, men are being taken over, men that are more qualified to be a CEO are not getting it. And on the flip side, maybe a female that's more qualified to be a nurse is not getting it because some male came in. Now, maybe I'm just living in it's a utopian type thought or mindset where that all will just work itself out, and it doesn't in reality, and that's why we have to overreach and make these policies and whatnot. But I just think we should do a better job of creating actual equal opportunity, and then let the outcomes fall as they may. Again,
Right.
It seems common sense,
Right. But a lot of the policies are targeted toward creating more equal outcomes, not enhancing opportunities. And once you get focused on the outcomes, you're doing a social engineering sort of thing, and those don't tend to go well.
They don't, and I think from that perspective, I think if you look at who makes policy, right? Congressional policy and folks running on a platform, it's not really going to get as much attention if you say you're fixing some of the opportunity blockers and some of the issues stopping equal opportunity. It's not as sexy. It's not as obvious that's going to have a long-term impact in the right way. But when you start saying, well, I have a policy, we have to have 10 men for every 10 women, or whatever it might be, then you kind of get that guaranteed outcome. I would say statement. Even though it's horrifically flawed, as we're talking about here, it does kind of build, I would say, I don't know, a constituent base quicker. If you get political, that's what their whole job is. So I wonder if that's a force as well, where they're just more incentivized to jump right to that outcome because it's more measurable. And you could say, look, we're going to get 10, and we're going to get 10 no matter what. Even if we don't take the most qualified or the most this or the most interested, we're just going to get them in there. And then it just has this trickle-down effect.
Yeah, it would certainly appeal to some voters, particularly activist types, but it probably would backfire with others who see it as social engineering.
Right. I have a note here too, just taking a small step backwards, but I definitely wanted to get your take on this, because your second blog about boys and girls culture, you talk a lot about boys tend to end up gravitating towards play with other boys, and girls tend to end up gravitating towards playing with other girls. I assume that is in the same vein as if left to their own devices, that's what they're going to do, right? Right.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. So, starting in the late preschool years and certainly moving into the early elementary school years, boys and girls tend to segregate into sex play groups. And they do this in part because they like different activities, and also they kind of influence each other in different ways. Now, this has been found everywhere it's been studied. And even if you look at traditional cultures where boys and girls, there aren't that many kids around, so they play in mixed sex and mixed age groups. And so it doesn't look like they're segregated. But when we actually look at, who's friends with whom, you get this same-sex bias there. And there have been studies that have, kind of dressed kids up in overalls, put hats on them so you couldn't tell their hair. If they're 7-year-olds, you can't tell whether they're male or female by the face. When they're dressed like that, and then just cut them loose, and after a while, they're separated out into boys group and a girls group.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Now, you can get boys and girls, you can reinforce them, like, give them candy or whatever to play together. But as soon as you stop the adult intervention, they segregate back out.
Interesting. Yeah, because I'm reading your article and I'm thinking, we mature, we grow up, as males. I'll just use boys for example. We're just hanging around other boys, understanding. We're working through our childhood problems with other boys. The girls are working through their childhood problems with the girls, and so we're almost like we don't understand the opposite sex as we get older. And nor do we have much interest in interacting with the opposite sex as we kind of grow up through a certain age. And then I kind of look at, I think I sent you this note, then at least for males, I can speak for myself, then you hit 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever it is, hormones kick in, and now you want sex, right? So that kicks in, and then you start making quote unquote girlfriends. And it's almost like without that hormonal drive, there's at least at that age, there's not much drive or interest in just hanging out with the opposite sex or learning about them or trying to solve or trying to go through life together with a, I would say, a compatible worldview, whatever it is. And then you fast forward to get older, and then you're supposed to marry the opposite sex and, and solve some of the your life's hardest problems together. It's almost like, wow, what an unfair, that's kind of a sucky situation. It's like, I don't even know what, both sides don't even know what the other side is. And then we're supposed to be, thrown in together and solve, and make it all work. Right. It's just an interesting, reality there.
Yeah. So boys learn how to deal with other people by engaging with boys, and girls the same with girls. Then when they come together, when they start kind of noticing one another in adolescence and have an interest in the opposite sex, their social styles are incompatible. Yeah, so boys say things and do things that hurt girls' feelings, and girls talk, about their feelings and stuff that they would do with their girlfriend, and the boys just don't understand it. They try to give them solutions to their problems when they just want to talk it through and so forth. So there's
guilty, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of miscommunication that goes on there, and most people eventually figure it out. So if we look at, moving fast forward to adulthood, if we look at a lot of traditional cultures, as I said before, a lot of the day-to-day activities are pretty sex segregated. The women working in fields, and men maybe hunting or tending herds or working in city or whatever it is that they're doing. And in a lot of cases, marriages are more pragmatic. They may get along and may be friends, but they may not. May be an arranged marriage. Who knows? And so the need for having the spouses being kind of really close confidants and so forth is really unusual overall, but it's common in wealthy societies, especially when men and women move away from their families because of jobs or whatever. So they're kind of the social networks they grew up with, they move away from that. So they're much more dependent on their spouses than they would be in other contexts. And so there you have this pressure to kind of work it out. And when it works out, it's great. It can work out really well. And other times it's just one miscommunication after another, and results in a tense relationship.
Well, it's work, right? I mean, it's a cliche to say marriage is work, or any relationship is work, but you, as a guy, you might have a best friend. That best friend, there's almost no work there. That's why they became your best friend, right? And the same in a woman has, a woman has their best friends, and there should be very little. And there's always going to be work, things you're going to have falling outs, things like that. But generally, that's a default. The default is easy, where marriage is. I feel like the default is almost, even if you get along, the default is, well, it's kind of adjusting the messaging and always trying to understand what they mean when they said this, when they didn't really mean it, because there are those, I feel like there literally are those gender differences that we need to be smart on. And that's why I love doing conversations like this, because you got to check all that PC crap at the door and get to the root and the reality of things. So you can actually get better at things. And I feel like getting better at relationships, getting better at marriage, getting better at being a mom or dad it's important to know the reality and not the crap that's out there. And that crap that's out there is just getting, with social media and the internet and in the digital age now, crap goes from someone's 2 a.m, I don't know, Red Bull fueled idea to becoming viral in a day, less, a minute, so it's just crazy. It's definitely a new world.
You have to take all of that stuff with a grain of salt. It turns out that women are much pick up on men's ways of communicating and stuff much more quickly than the opposite.
Sure. Oh, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Generally better at reading social nuance and dealing with one-on-one relationships. So it's probably a little bit more work on the men's side.
Yep.
And than the women's, but it's definitely the case. You and your best friend or best friends because you like similar activities. Maybe you like sporting events or roughhousing, or you like talking about finance or whatever it is. It's there, and your way of communicating with one another, you know how it works. You do it, and you don't have to say much, and it happens, and it's okay. But women communicate with much more detail, much more personal sorts of things. The emotional experience and all that is much more important, and it takes some experience for guys to figure that out.
Oh, for sure. And you give that example of 5 guys sitting around watching a football game could almost say nothing to each other for 2 to 3 hours, and there's no issue whatsoever. And in fact, especially if their team wins, there's even they come out of it feeling more bonded, right? And on the opposite side of 4 or 5 females was hanging out and no one spoke to each other for 2-3 hours. Excuse me. They'd all think they hated each other. Or there's some problem, and right.
It would be extremely uncomfortable for them, and they would all be thinking somebody's mad about it.
Oh yeah. How many times I've come home from work and had just a crazy day, and I haven't spoken, just eaten dinner, and I said 3 words. And I came home. It's like the first question is everything okay? I'm like, this is my default state, is not talking. It just is, right?
That's right. Yeah. Everything's fine. Yeah.
Exactly.
But if your best friend acted like that,
right,
your best friend would expect them to draw it out of them. Okay, what's the problem? Having issues at work, having issues with your mom again, or whatever, because they know about their best friend, and their best friend really needs that social support and to talk out, but they don't always want to directly say
exactly right.
So their friends brought up, and then they take that same. Women then assume men are kind of the same, but they're not.
Nope.
And so it's kind of misunderstanding.
Right. So I guess kind of wrap this up a little, but I mean, do you see where in terms of trends, now, do you see where any of this is going? And we talked about a lot of the pressures you and your fellow colleagues probably feel just doing research in this area and just looking for the quote unquote searching for the truth, looking in the data. Do you feel like it's going to get worse before it gets better, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I suspect it'll probably get worse before it gets better. I think part of what's going on is that it's becoming, at least people who do this work and are serious about trying to understand it, becoming more and more clear that you really can't deny the biological influences on sex differences. And there's brain imaging studies now, there's genetic studies, and there's hormonal studies. I mean, there's more and more weekly. And the more, there's a lot of things to be worked out. I mean, we don't have everything out for sure. But a straight socialization sort of argument just doesn't work anymore. And the more the evidence becomes, the more the biological evidence becomes clearer, the louder the activists are screaming.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I just think folks like you and I and others just keep, just need to focus on the data. And I think we all need, gets to something I always bring up, and I probably said it a million times on this show, but compassion needs to be priority one. So when we're talking about these things, you need to, and I think, especially like the Republican Party, I think, because they seem to be, they always want posing some of the stuff with the left, and this on both sides, but even on the left, they want to always call, hate or Nazi, that whole Nazi, theme and the hateful, and the problem is a lot of folks are actually guilty of that non-compassion and that hateful behavior, and that ruins it for the rest of us. So I think compassion needs to be number one when you're talking through hard problems, but it should never go from, never should get to that next level of, well, I don't want to be called a Nazi, so I'll just ignore the data or skew the data, or that's where we're all in trouble. I think that's where we just can't let that happen. So, but I think,
and yeah, and people do those, personal attacks because they're trying to bully and intimidate because they don't want this sort of thing to be known because it disrupts their own belief system, which makes it uncomfortable. But a couple of things. One, generally, you have to have compassion and you have to have an open mind.
Sure.
You have to think about it, like, okay, what are you saying? What's the evidence for this? Why do you want to believe that it's this when, there's a lot of evidence that it's something.
Right.
It's something else. And the other thing is, nature is pretty much indifferent to social arguments.
It doesn't care, right? It doesn't care.
Social media, and so's a 3-year-old boy and a girl. They don't know anything of it. They're going to do what they're going to do, and regardless of the arguments, and the freer people are, the more obvious that's going to be.
Yep, agreed. Well, fantastic closing. Well said. So you said the next iteration of your book is coming out. When did you say?
It is. I've finished it. It goes to external reviews, so I should get the reviews back from the reviewers and the editors actually next week, and then I make revisions and I'll submit it back to them. And as long as everything stays on schedule, should be probably August, maybe July of next year, and it'll cover everything. It'll be a 700-page book. Going from the evolution of sexual reproduction all the way through sex differences and interest in engineering.
Oh, very cool. So a longer version of what we talked about, sounds like.
Yep.
Very
longer.
Cool. Yeah. 700-page version. Wow. Well, excellent. Well, David, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I definitely, I had a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
You got it. Okay. Well, have a great weekend.
All right. You too.
Thanks, David. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening. This is Unlatched Mind. We'll catch you next time. See ya.